Operation Paperclip, Nazi scientists forgiven after World War II. In 1945, the war had just ended and Europe was still buried in ashes. People shouted for justice, believing that all the Nazis would pay at the Nuremberg trials. Everyone imagined those who experimented on living people, those who built weapons of mass destruction, standing in court and then being hanged. But life is never that simple. Behind the flashing cameras and public verdicts, dirty deals were already being made. The US and the Soviet Union both thought something kind of damn twisted. Killing them all would be a waste. These guys are crazy smart. What if we use them? That's how Operation Paperclip, a fancy-sounding plan that was really just about scooping up Nazi talent from the rubble, was born. The most famous name on the list was Wernher von Braun. This wasn't some innocent scientist. He was a legit SS officer, the father of the V-2 rocket. That rocket rained terror on London, killing thousands of civilians. And worse, to build it, von Braun used slave labor. Prisoners forced to work until they dropped dead, with some literally hanged on the spot if they slowed down. A crime, plain and simple. Yet after the war, instead of rotting in prison, he was welcomed to America with open arms. Given a house, a salary, and a lab, he went from serving Hitler to becoming the father of NASA. That plot twist is crazy as hell. Why would the US look the other way? The answer is short and brutal: the Cold War. As soon as the US and the Soviet Union started racing for rockets in space, they needed anyone with the skills to deliver. And the Nazi scientists had exactly that. Over 1,600 German scientists were brought to the US, while the Soviets snatched a few hundred of their own. The men who should have faced justice were instead sipping coffee in labs, sketching designs for their new bosses. Justice? Yeah, right, justice is for people who aren't useful. And it wasn't just engineers. Some Nazi doctors, the ones who carried out horrific experiments on prisoners, also escaped punishment. These were the monsters who shoved people into pressure chambers, tested poison gases, forced prisoners to drink seawater until their kidneys failed. Their research was bought with blood and suffering. But American intelligence still quietly kept their data, calling it too valuable to throw away. Some of that information even trickled into post-war medical research. Gross as hell, but that's history for you. Then came the 1960s and 70s, and the world watched the most absurd scene of all. Wernher von Braun, former SS officer, grinning in photos with Kennedy and US astronauts. The American press hailed him as a genius, the symbol of the dream of space exploration. People applauded with pride. Meanwhile, the thousands of souls who died at Mittelwerk? Forgotten. Later in Germany, the V-2 rocket was even displayed in museums as a scientific achievement. An achievement built on blood rebranded as glory. Damn, that's cold. Looking back, the lesson is clear. Justice doesn't always win. National interest usually does. Forgiveness doesn't happen because of compassion, but because someone is still useful. And history can bleach the darkest villains white if it wants to. Von Braun went from Hitler's officer to NASA's hero with just one PR spin. So the next time you see someone praised as a great genius, don't be too quick to believe it. Behind the spotlight, there might be a mountain of corpses. Lucky Luciano, the mafia boss who got away. In 1942, while World War II was still raging, the United States faced a bizarre problem. The East Coast was vulnerable to Nazi sabotage. The New York harbor was the most important gateway for troops and supplies, but intelligence reports warned that German spies might already be inside, ready to blow up ships or wreck logistics. The US military freaked out, but there was a brutal truth. The police and the Navy couldn't possibly control every single corner of the docks. For decades, that territory had belonged to the mafia. Enter Charles Lucky Luciano, one of the most infamous mafia bosses in New York. Before the war, Luciano had been sentenced to 30-50 years in prison for running prostitution rings and organized crime. Everyone thought he'd rot in a cell until the day he died. But nah, life isn't a justice movie. When war knocks on your door, suddenly even a gangster can become useful. The US Navy secretly approached Luciano in prison. They made him an offer that sounded straight out of a WTF script. In exchange for the mafia's help protecting the docks, Luciano would get his sentence reduced, and maybe even walk free. A literal deal with the devil. And of course, Luciano wasn't stupid. This was his golden ticket, a chance to transform from criminal scum into patriotic hero. So the mafia, through Luciano's network on the outside, quickly took control of the New York docks. Any stranger who showed up got noticed instantly. Suspicious people, they disappeared fast. Dock workers and sailors who had always been under mafia threats were suddenly protected because the very gangsters who had bullied them now doubled as guardians of the nation. Damn, the irony was insane. The deal didn't stop at the docks. In 1943, when the US prepared to invade Italy, Operation Husky, the Navy once again needed help. Who had better connections on the ground in Sicily than the mafia? When American soldiers landed, they were guided by local mobsters who hated Mussolini. In many towns, mafia bosses literally opened doors, pointed out the best routes, and smoothed the way for the Allies. The mafia, crushed by Mussolini before the war, now bounced back thanks to their friendship with America. And guess what happened after the war? Luciano, the man sentenced to half a century in prison, served only about 10 years. In 1946, he was released, officially recognized for his service to the nation. The truth? The mafia had secured the docks and helped the US in Sicily. Justice, please. A man who had built an empire of crime, who had blood on his hands and terrorized New York, walked out of prison with the label of a silent hero. Crazy as hell. After his release, Luciano was deported back to Italy, but he still lived comfortably, continuing his underground influence. Newspapers of the time wrote about him not just as a criminal, but as a strange patriot who had helped America in its darkest hour. Ironically, the mafia came out of the war stronger than ever, with newfound credibility. And Luciano became a living legend, worshipped by generations of mobsters as the ultimate role model. But that's how it went down. Sammy the Bull Gravano, the hitman who killed 19 but walked free. When you talk about the American mafia in the 20th century, the name Sammy the Bull Gravano always pops up. Terrifying, infamous, and a living contradiction. This guy wasn't some small-time thug. He was the right-hand man of John Gotti, one of New York's most feared mafia bosses. But what made Gravano truly stand out wasn't just his loyalty or his influence, it was the chilling number he admitted to: 19 murders. Yeah, you heard that right, 19. Now you'd think anyone who confessed to killing nearly 20 people would be stuck with life in prison or end up in the electric chair. But nah, Gravano is the perfect example of what I call a villain who walked free. Thanks to one crazy deal, he dodged a heavy sentence and only spent a handful of years behind bars. Wild, right? Let's rewind. In the late 1980s, the FBI was targeting the Gambino crime family led by John Gotti. The problem? Gotti was slick as hell. He never got his hands dirty. He gave the orders but made others pull the trigger. His most trusted enforcer was Gravano, nicknamed the Bull because, well, he was unstoppable. If someone stood in the way, Gravano handled it. If someone betrayed the family, Gravano cleaned it up. The Gambinos were untouchable until the FBI pulled off a sneaky move. They bugged a restaurant and recorded Gotti talking. Those tapes showed Gotti ordering hits, and this is the kicker, bad-mouthing Gravano, calling him stupid. Imagine being Gravano, hearing those tapes after killing 19 people for your boss. He must have thought, damn, I kill for you, and you call me an idiot? That. And so Gravano flipped. In one of the wildest betrayals in mafia history, he decided to testify against Gotti. The deal was simple. Gravano spills everything, becomes a star witness, and in exchange, he gets a lighter sentence. The result? John Gotti, the so-called Teflon Don, who had slipped out of every trial before, finally got nailed with a life sentence, no parole. And Gravano, a cold-blooded hitman with 19 bodies on his conscience, he walked out after just 5 years in prison. After that, he even opened businesses, gave interviews, and wrote a book about his mafia life. That plot twist was insane. Of course, Gravano being Gravano, he couldn't stay clean. After his release, he got caught up in drug trafficking in Arizona and was sent back to prison again. The bloody history of the American mafia is full of killers and betrayals, but Gravano's case is the clearest example of how justice can bend. When a villain is useful, even murder can be forgiven. William Calley, The My Lai Massacre and the Joke of Justice. In 1968, in the middle of the brutal Vietnam War, one of the darkest stains on the US military took place in the village of My Lai, Quang Ngai. The man at the center of this nightmare was Lieutenant William Calley. His name sounds like it belongs in some Hollywood war drama, but reality was far uglier. Calley became the symbol of what you could call half-baked justice, because a guy who ordered the slaughter of hundreds of innocent civilians basically walked free in the end. On March 16, 1968, Calley's unit entered the village of My Lai. They didn't find enemy fighters, no Viet Cong ambush. What they saw were villagers, old men, women, kids, even babies. But instead of pulling back or protecting civilians, Calley gave the order to fire. In just a few hours, more than 500 civilians were murdered. Some were shot while running. Women were raped before being killed. Children were thrown into ditches and executed. My Lai turned into hell on earth that day. Reading about it already chills you. Imagine what the villagers lived through. And Calley wasn't just standing by. Witnesses testified that he personally shot civilians at close range. In his head, every villager was potentially the enemy. So he treated human lives like they were nothing more than weeds to be cut down. Eventually, word of the massacre leaked to the American press. The entire nation went into shock. The carefully polished image of the US Army, civilized, fighting for freedom, shattered overnight. Congress launched an investigation. The public was outraged. Millions protested in the streets. Everyone thought this time justice will finally be served. How could it not? a lieutenant who ordered the killing of 500 civilians. Case closed, right? In 1971, William Calley finally faced trial. After a long process, he was sentenced to life in prison for murder. On paper, that sounded right. But here comes the plot twist that screams, American justice LOL. Just days after the verdict, President Richard Nixon stepped in and reduced his sentence. Calley didn't serve life. Instead, he was put under house arrest. And how long did that last? Just 3.5 years. After that, William Calley was free. Let that sink in. A man who oversaw the massacre of 500 civilians, including women and children, ended up serving less time than some car thieves. That's not justice, that's a joke. And what makes it worse? Many Americans at the time actually supported Calley. They said he was just following orders, a victim of a flawed war, not a war criminal. Thousands of letters flooded the White House demanding mercy. Some states even raised funds to support him. The world turned upside down. The murderer became a kind of folk hero. After his release, Calley lived a relatively peaceful life. He opened a business, blended into civilian life, and decades later gave a half-hearted public apology. But really, what's one apology compared to 500 dead villagers? It meant nothing. The William Calley story is a textbook example of how justice bends during wartime. And that's why My Lai remains one of the ugliest, most unforgettable stains on America's history.